at 38,000 feet above the Atlantic. A routine international flight was about to become a viral scandal that would end a career and put someone behind bars. What started as a minor seating issue quickly spiraled into something far uglier, fueled by unchecked authority and a dangerous assumption about who deserved respect. Passengers watched in stunned silence as one man was singled out, humiliated, and treated like a problem simply for existing in the wrong seat. Body. The flight attendant thought she was dealing with just another passenger she could push around. She had no idea the quiet man she targeted controlled companies worth billions, employed thousands, and had a legal team on speed dial. By the time the plane landed, lives were already ruined. The man boarding the plane that morning did not look like someone people made space for. There was no entourage trailing behind him, no designer logos announcing wealth, no air of urgency that demanded attention. He moved calmly through the terminal, dressed in muted colors, carrying only a slim leather bag that had seen years of use. To everyone around him, he blended into the background of early morning travelers, business people half awake, families juggling luggage, tourists already exhausted before takeoff. That anonymity was intentional. He had learned long ago that invisibility offered a rare kind of freedom. His life, away from airports and boarding gates, was anything but ordinary. Over 2 decades, he had built a sprawling business empire that quietly touched millions of lives, logistics networks spanning continents, tech platforms embedded into everyday systems, investments that shaped markets without ever making headlines. He was a billionaire by any formal definition, but not the kind celebrated on magazine covers or paraded on social media. Privacy was his currency, and humility his armor. It kept his world predictable, controlled, and, most importantly, peaceful. That morning's flight was meant to be uneventful. A long-haul international trip booked last minute to attend a closed-door meeting that could redefine the future of one of his largest ventures. The ticket was first class, purchased not for luxury, but for efficiency. He valued sleep, space to think, and the ability to arrive sharp. He had taken thousands of flights in his life, and experience had taught him that blending in reduced friction. He boarded early, found his seat, and settled in without drawing attention. Around him, the cabin filled with the familiar choreography of air travel. Overhead bins slammed shut. Passengers negotiated armrests with polite smiles that vanished seconds later. Flight attendants moved with rehearsed efficiency, their expressions professional, detached, and practiced. Among them was one attendant in particular whose posture carried an unmistakable sense of authority. She had worked this route for years and knew exactly how much power came with a uniform at 38,000 feet. To her, order mattered more than people. Rules were less about safety and more about control. She noticed him almost immediately, not because he was disruptive or confused, but because he didn't match the mental image she had formed of who belonged in certain spaces. His calm demeanor, his lack of visible status symbols, and his quiet presence seemed to register as an anomaly. The seat he occupied, spacious, clearly first class, looked, in her mind, mismatched with the person sitting in it. That silent judgment took root before she ever checked a boarding pass. For years, she had enforced her version of order on flights with minimal resistance. Most passengers complied. Some complained quietly. Others shrank under scrutiny, eager to avoid confrontation. Rarely did anyone challenge her authority, and when they did, she knew how to escalate just enough to make them regret it. She had developed an unspoken belief that her instincts were always right. If someone looked out of place, they probably were, and if they were questioned, they should be grateful she was doing her job. The man, unaware of the attention he had drawn, focused on the small rituals that grounded him before important meetings. He reviewed notes mentally, breathing slowly, tuning out the cabin noise. Flying had once been a luxury to him, a symbol of success after years of struggle. But time had stripped it of meaning. Planes were just moving rooms, now places where he was reminded, subtly and often, that wealth did not erase how the world saw him. He had experienced this before, not loudly, not dramatically, but in small, corrosive moments. Extra scrutiny at security. Assumptions about seating errors, delayed service, unnecessary questions. He had learned to absorb them quietly, choosing battles carefully. Confrontation rarely produced justice in the moment, and he had responsibilities far larger than personal pride. Still, each incident left a mark. As boarding finished and the cabin settled, the flight attendant approached his row under the guise of routine checks. Two nearby passengers, it looked ordinary, an employee verifying seats, another traveler being momentarily inconvenienced. But there was a sharpness to her focus, a certainty in her body language that signaled this was not routine at all. She was not checking, she was challenging. Her presence shifted the energy around them. Other passengers sensed it, but looked away, pretending to adjust screens or scroll phones. Nobody wanted to be part of a scene before takeoff. The power imbalance was clear. In the air, flight attendants represented authority, and passengers no matter their status on the ground were expected to comply. The man remained composed. Years in boardrooms had taught him that calm unnerved those who thrived on dominance. He did not reach for his ticket immediately. He did not protest or explain. He simply waited, observing, reading the situation the way. He read market-watching patterns, identifying motives, calculating consequences. What he could not yet know was that this moment, seemingly insignificant, would cascade far beyond the cabin walls. The flight attendant's assumption would trigger a chain of events involving corporate lawyers, federal investigators, airline executives, and a public reckoning. No one on that plane could have predicted. A routine flight would become evidence. A uniform would become a liability. And a man who had spent his life avoiding attention would be forced into the spotlight. As the aircraft doors closed and engines prepared for pushback, the balance of power felt firmly one-sided. One person believed she held all the control. The other understood something far more important. Power, when misused, leaves a trail. And every trail eventually leads somewhere. The plane had not yet left the ground. But the story was Alra, once the plane reached cruising altitude. The tension that had quietly formed in the first-class cabin did not dissipate. It thickened. What should have been a smooth transition into the monotony of long-haul travel instead became a slow, deliberate tightening of control by someone convinced she had been challenged. The flight attendant's initial scrutiny had not satisfied her. In her mind, compliance was not enough. Submission was expected. She returned to his row under increasingly thin pretenses. First, it was a secondary verification of seating assignments. Then, an unnecessary reminder about cabin policies that every frequent flyer already knew. Each interaction carried an edge subtle to some, unmistakable to others. The man noticed the pattern immediately. This was no longer about procedure. It was about asserting dominance and correcting what she perceived as an imbalance. Around them, other first-class passengers began to register that something was wrong. The frequency of her visits stood out. The way her attention lingered on one passenger while ignoring others was impossible to miss. Still, no one intervened. In enclosed spaces, discomfort often breeds silence. People convince themselves that someone else will speak up, or that the situation must be justified somehow. Authority, even when misused, has a way of quieting dissent. The man remained restrained, but internally he began documenting everything. Years of navigating hostile environments had taught him that memory alone was unreliable. He paid attention to timing, tone, body language, and escalation. He noticed how her posture stiffened each time he responded calmly instead of defensively. How her frustration grew not from resistance, but from his refusal to appear intimidated. Her actions escalated gradually, as misuse of power often does. She began hovering during meal service, delaying his tray while serving others first. When she finally returned, it was with an air of forced politeness, masking irritation. She scrutinized his requests more than anyone else's, correcting minor details that did not warrant correction. Each interaction was small enough to be dismissed individually, but together they formed a pattern of targeted behavior. Other crew members noticed. Some avoided eye contact. Others exchanged quick glances, silently acknowledging that something felt off. But challenging a colleague mid-flight came with risks, professional, social, and procedural. The airline culture prized unity, even when it meant overlooking misconduct. It was easier to let it continue than to disrupt the hierarchy. As hours passed, the flight attendant's behavior became more overt. She questioned his movements when he stood to stretch. She lingered nearby when he used the aisle, watching as though waiting for a misstep. The scrutiny was no longer subtle, it was performative. Passengers in adjacent rows began paying attention, their curiosity sharpening into concern. What she did not realize was that the cabin was no longer just a closed environment. Many passengers had phones angled carefully, screens dimmed but cameras active. In an era where power is constantly audited by the public, authority figures are never as unobserved as they believe. The man himself did not record anything, but he noticed the quiet movements of others who did. The psychological weight of the situation began to show, not on him, but on her. Each attempt to reassert control failed to provoke the reaction she wanted. He did not argue. He did not plead. He did not display embarrassment. Instead, he remained steady, respectful, and unmoved. That calm became a mirror, reflecting the irrationality of her behavior back at her. Her certainty began to harden into resentment. She interpreted his composure as defiance, his silence as mockery. In her worldview, people who belonged in positions of authority looked and behaved a certain way. Those who didn't fit that image were supposed to shrink when challenged. His refusal to do so disrupted her sense of order. Eventually, she crossed a line that could not be walked back. She initiated a formal escalation, framing the situation as a compliance issue rather than a personal one. She involved a senior crew member, presenting her version of events with selective emphasis. In her telling, she was maintaining safety. She was enforcing policy. She was responding to resistance. The facts were bent just enough to justify intervention, without outright fabrication. The senior crew member approached with caution, sensing the tension but not yet understanding its depth. The man calmly complied with every procedural request, offering documentation when asked, maintaining the same measured demeanor he had held all flight. The lack of any actual violation became increasingly obvious. There was no disruption. Refusal. No threat. Just a man being persistently targeted. That discrepancy created cracks in the narrative. Cracks wide enough for doubt to seep in. Nearby passengers began speaking quietly among themselves. What they had initially dismissed as a misunderstanding now appeared deliberate. Patterns became clear when viewed from a distance. The frequency, the tone, the imbalance. A few passengers, emboldened by the growing awareness, began taking mental notes of their own. Names, times, sequences. The flight attendant, however, doubled down. Backtracking would mean admitting error, and error was something she had never learned to accept. Her authority had always protected her before. She believed it would protect her now. What she failed to understand was that authority without restraint often leaves evidence, and evidence has a way of traveling faster than intention. As the plane continued across time zones and darkness, the situation took on a life of its own. What had begun as a personal bias was now a documented incident witnessed by dozens. The cabin atmosphere shifted from discomfort to anticipation. People sensed that this was no longer just an unpleasant flight, it was the beginning of consequences. The man, fully aware now that the situation had surpassed inconvenience, made a quiet decision. He would not intervene emotionally. He would not expose his identity prematurely. He would allow the process to unfold naturally, knowing that systems, when properly engaged, often reveal more than confrontation ever could. By the time the descent began, the imbalance of power had subtly reversed. The flight attendant still wore the uniform. She still issued instructions. But the certainty that had fueled her behavior was gone, replaced by tension and defensiveness. She could feel eyes on her. Not judging yet, but observing. When the wheels finally touched the runway, relief swept through the cabin. For most passengers, it was the relief of arrival. For a few, it was the relief of knowing the situation had been contained long enough to be addressed properly on the ground. For her, it was the beginning of a reckoning she could not yet see coming. And for him, it was the moment he knew that. The most intense part of the story had not happened in the air at all, but was waiting just beyond the gate. The moment the aircraft doors opened, the illusion of control collapsed. What had felt contained at 38,000 feet immediately spilled into the terminal, where authorities shifted from uniforms designed to manage comfort to systems built to investigate conduct. The flight attendants stepped onto the jet bridge, believing the incident would dissolve into paperwork and internal reviews. Just another complaint filed away and forgotten. She had relied on that assumption her entire career. This time, it betrayed her. The man exited the plane without urgency. He moved through the arrival corridor with the same quiet precision that had defined his entire presence on the flight. To the untrained eye, he was simply another traveler, disembarking after a long journey. But behind that calm exterior, a process had already been activated, one that did not depend on raised voices or public confrontation. It depended on records, witnesses, and accountability. Airport staff had been alerted before the last passenger even stood up. Not because of his status, which remained undisclosed, but because the volume and consistency of reports had crossed a threshold airlines could not ignore. Multiple passengers had independently flagged the same employee, the same behavior, the same pattern. When complaints align without coordination, institutions pay attention. Security personnel approached with procedural neutrality, escorting both parties separately under the guise of routine follow-up. The flight attendant bristled internally, masking irritation with forced professionalism. She still believed this was temporary. She still believed she was protected. In a private room away from foot traffic, the narrative she had relied on began to unravel. Her version of events was presented first, as protocol often favors staff accounts. She framed her actions as safety-driven, situational, necessary. But as she spoke, inconsistencies surfaced. Timelines shifted. Justifications blurred. What she described as resistance did not align with the lack of any recorded disruption. What? She framed. As enforcement lacked a corresponding policy violation. Then the process. Widened passenger statements were introduced, calm, precise, and remarkably consistent. Observations of repeated targeting. Notes on tone and demeanor. Accounts of unnecessary scrutiny. None of them accused her explicitly. They didn't need to. Patterns spoke louder than intent. The absence of provocation became impossible to ignore. Video footage followed. Not dramatic, not confrontational. Just quiet documentation from multiple angles. A figure lingering too long. A presence hovering without cause. A single passenger receiving disproportionate attention. The footage did not need interpretation. It simply existed. The flight attendant's confidence fractured under the weight of evidence. What escalated the situation? Beyond an internal disciplinary matter was not humiliation or exposure. Was her response once authority slipped from her grasp, frustration bled into defensiveness. Procedural cooperation gave way to resistance. She challenged the legitimacy of the inquiry, questioned motives, and attempted to reassert control where none existed. In doing so, she crossed from professional misconduct into obstruction. That was the turning point. A federal compliance officer, already present due to jurisdictional requirements on international arrivals, became involved. What had been an airline issue was now a regulatory one. Her actions were no longer evaluated solely through corporate policy, but through legal standards governing discrimination, abuse of authority, and interference with official processes. The man remained silent through most of it. When asked for identification, he complied without ceremony. No announcement. No emphasis. Just documentation placed on the table. The shift in the room was immediate, not because of wealth alone, but because of what that wealth represented. Access, credibility, and the ability to sustain scrutiny indefinitely. Background checks moved faster than anyone anticipated. His name, while absent from tabloids, carried weight in legal and regulatory circles. Companies tied to infrastructure, logistics, and public systems. Government contracts. Compliance histories. The realization dawned slowly. Then all at once, this was not someone who could be dismissed. The flight attendant's situation deteriorated rapidly. Her attempts to contextualize her behavior were now viewed through a harsher lens. Prior complaints. Surface ones, previously deemed inconclusive, now reinterpreted as part of a broader pattern. Incidents that had once seemed isolated, aligned into something unmistakable. The presence of witnesses transformed discretion into obligation. Officials could no longer de-escalate quietly. Transparency became mandatory. The process, once procedural, turned clinical. When she attempted to leave the area without authorization, it sealed the outcome. Restraint was applied not for spectacle, but for compliance. The act was quiet, efficient, and devastating. In a public space designed for transit and anonymity, she became the focal point of consequence. Passengers slowed. Phones lowered. Silence replaced curiosity. The arrest was administrative in appearance, but symbolic in impact. For years, she had exercised authority without accountability, shielded by uniform and routine. Now, stripped of both, she was just another individual facing the consequences of documented actions. Charges were not theatrical. They were precise. Interference, discrimination, abuse of authority. Each one grounded in evidence she had unknowingly helped create. The man observed, none of it directly. He had already been escorted out through a separate corridor, insulated from the chaos, not by privilege, but by protocol. His involvement was complete. Statements had been given. Records submitted. The rest would unfold without him. News of the incident spread quickly, but not chaotically. It moved through corporate channels, regulatory bulletins, and eventually, public reporting. Headlines framed it as a reckoning. Social discourse dissected power dynamics. The airline issued statements, heavy with language about values and accountability. But beneath the noise was a simpler truth. A single assumption, left unchecked, had triggered a collapse. The flight attendant's authority had not been taken from her by wealth or status. It had been dismantled by her own certainty, the belief that she could identify who belonged and act on that. Belief without consequence had blinded her to the reality of oversight. For the man, the climax was not the arrest or the exposure. It was the confirmation of something he had learned long ago and rarely tested so directly. Systems fail when individuals are allowed to operate without humility, but they correct themselves when evidence is allowed to accumulate. The incident became a case study. In training modules, in compliance seminars, in internal memos circulated quietly across the industry. It wasn't the wealth of the targeted passenger that resonated. It was the documentation, the witnesses, the refusal to escalate emotionally. By the time legal proceedings formally began, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The most intense moment had already passed and awed in a courtroom. But in the instant, authority met accountability and lost. And just like that, at the end of what was supposed to be an ordinary flight, the balance of power shifted permanently. Not with shouting, not with revenge, but with consequences that could not be ignored. In the weeks that followed the incident, the story continued to unfold far beyond the airport walls, reshaping lives in ways no one involved had anticipated. What initially appeared to be a single episode of misconduct soon revealed itself as a fault line running through systems designed to function on trust, professionalism, and unchecked authority. The legal process moved with deliberate precision. Unlike viral scandals that burn brightly and fade quickly, this case advanced quietly, driven by documentation rather than outrage. Investigators reconstructed the flight, minute by minute. Crew schedules, internal communications, passenger statements, and digital records were aligned into a clear sequence of events. The evidence did not rely on interpretation or emotion. It relied on patterns. The flight attendant was formally charged, not for a single act, but for a series of decisions that demonstrated intent, escalation, and abuse of authority. The charges reflected a broader accountability framework, one that recognized how power, when exercised selectively, becomes discriminatory, even without explicit language. Her defense centered on misjudgment and stress. But those explanations collapsed under the consistency of witness accounts and prior complaints. In court, there were no dramatic outbursts or emotional appeals. The proceedings were methodical, almost clinical. That, in itself, was devastating. The absence of spectacle stripped away any chance of reframing the narrative. The facts spoke uninterrupted. The verdict was swift. A custodial sentence was imposed. Not severe in length, but profound in symbolism. It marked a rare instance where workplace discrimination, compounded by obstruction and misuse of authority, resulted in jail time rather than termination alone. For many watching from the outside, the outcome felt unprecedented. For regulators, it felt overdue. The airline moved just as decisively. Within days of the verdict, internal policies were revised. Bias training was no longer a box to check, but a monitored requirement tied to performance and promotion. Reporting systems were overhauled to reduce fear of retaliation among crew members and passengers alike. Patterns of complaints were reevaluated across departments, revealing other instances that, while less severe, had been quietly normalized. Executives issued public statements emphasizing accountability, but internally, the message was sharper. Authority was to be exercised transparently or not at all. The uniform was redefined not as a symbol of control, but of responsibility for the man at the center of it all. Life returned to its familiar rhythm almost immediately. He declined interviews. He ignored requests for commentary. He refused to become a public figure for an incident he never sought. His involvement ended the moment the system engaged properly. That decision puzzled many, but it was consistent with the way he had lived his life. Visibility had never been his goal. Correction had privately impact lingered. The incident reinforced a truth. He had learned across decades of navigating spaces where he was both powerful and underestimated. Wealth could open doors, but it could not prevent bias. Silence could preserve peace, but it could also enable harm. The difference lay in knowing when to step aside and when to let systems do their work. He returned to his companies with renewed focus, directing resources toward initiatives he had long supported quietly: equity audits, leadership accountability programs, and third-party oversight mechanisms. Not as a reaction, but as a reinforcement. The incident had not changed his values. It had validated them. 4 passengers who had witnessed the events. The impact was personal and lasting. Some described a shift in how they viewed authority in confined spaces. Others reflected on their own silence during moments of discomfort and resolved to speak sooner next time. A few became advocates, sharing their experiences not for attention, but to normalize intervention when something feels wrong. The videos captured during the flight were never sensationalized in court. They were not weaponized. Instead, they became examples in training environments, proof that accountability does not require confrontation, only consistency and awareness. The broader public conversation evolved as well. Unlike many stories framed around wealth shielding individuals from consequences, this one inverted the expectation. A billionaire was not protected because of his status. He was targeted in spite of it. The resolution challenged the assumption that power always flows in one direction. It demonstrated that institutional authority, when left unchecked, can outweigh personal wealth until oversight intervenes. Commentators noted the irony. The flight attendants' actions were driven by assumptions about who held power, who deserved respect, and who could be challenged without risk. Those assumptions proved catastrophically wrong, not because the man was rich, but because he was prepared, patient, and unwilling to let misconduct slide quietly in professional circles. The case became a reference point. Legal teams cited it when advising corporations on liability. Compliance officers used it to illustrate how minor infractions accumulate into major consequences. Training programs across industries referenced it as an example of how bias operates, subtly, often disguised as procedure. The most enduring impact, however, was cultural. The incident disrupted the comfort of those who relied on ambiguity to excuse behavior. It reminded institutions that neutrality is not passive, it must be enforced. It reminded employees that authority is not ownership. And it reminded individuals that dignity does not need to be loud to be defended. For the flight attendant, the consequences extended far beyond the sentence itself. Her career ended permanently. Certifications were revoked. Industry bans followed. Future employment prospects narrowed dramatically, not because of public outrage, but because of documented unfitness to hold authority over others. The uniform that once insulated her now marked a cautionary tale. There was no redemption arc offered publicly, no interviews, no platform to reframe the narrative. The silence that followed was not imposed, was the natural result of accountability. Years later, The incident would still be referenced quietly whenever discussions of power and bias arose. Not as a spectacle, but as a warning, a reminder that assumptions carry weight, that authority leaves footprints, that every action taken under the belief of impunity is recorded somewhere, by systems, by people, by time, and perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated that justice does not always arrive with drama. Sometimes it arrives with paperwork, witnesses, and the steady unraveling of certainty. One flight, one assumption, one decision to let the system work, and in the end, a lasting impact that reached far beyond the cabin, far beyond the runway, and far beyond the moment when someone believed they could act without consequence and were proven wrong.